note on energy issues, taking the opposite position of the Johnny one note. But on this issue, you and I agree. This is even a blind squirrel occasionally, and so we should work together on this. Chair recognizes now the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden.
I want to follow up where my colleague from Illinois left off in terms of getting broadband out into the rural areas. As I mentioned, my district's about 70,000 square miles, and so you want to talk about rural, we got it. And that is a big challenge. And Ms. Patterson, you mentioned telemedicine. I visited a hospital out in John Day a few years ago that had just been able to hook up into broadband, and precisely what you outlined is the case. Gentleman who used to have to commute to Bend, and it was several hours drive, and if the roads were snowy and icy, which they frequently are from about October until about October, he didn't have to do that for whatever the procedure was. He could sit in the hospital there in John Day. They'd communicate over broadband with St. Charles. It would be a 20-minute visit in the hospital, but he'd have to drive several hours each way to achieve that. And so it strikes me that when it comes to our health care, Mr. Lucas, when it comes to our education, and Mr. Ramsey, when it comes to reaching out into Native American tribes, it's all about getting this wire or wireless communication. And so I'm curious, Mr. Ramsey, in terms of the work you're doing with the Umatillas and the Warm Springs, how much of this is an issue there's no wire to the house versus other socioeconomic issues? And can we trump all of that, as Mr. Lucas has indicated, by going wireless, which being an old radio broadcaster, we were sort of there before it was popular, to do the wireless thing?
Well, Congressman, there's no question that wireless opens up a lot of possibilities because you've always had the last mile issue. So in large rural areas, when you look at the promise of issues like WiMAX and what that might potentially do, again, it opens up the opportunity to get people access. Then we still have to make sure it's affordable, and then we still have to work on the application side of it so that we can make sure adoption occurs. In a lot of rural areas, one of the issues that comes up is the ability to age in place. And so technology gives you the ability to age in place because it opens up opportunities. Intel is doing some amazing work around aging in place. You also have chronic disease management,
right?
And there's more opportunities being opened up by using that. So these are all crucial issues, urban and rural, but clearly greater opportunities to take advantage of this in rural areas.
Mr. Lucas, in terms of the wireless future, can we just sort of leapfrog from where we are with USF and do you think go into sort of a wireless future that's broadband and get your phone and your internet, or not?
I work all over the world, and it's an interesting conundrum that in the United States, in Wyoming, we can't get wireless, but I work in the middle of Africa, in the middle of nowhere, and I can get wireless.
Right.
I can get it in Eastern Europe. I can get wireless. I can get wireless almost any place in the world except in the United States. So something's not working, and that's what's important.
And is that because we have the embedded cost structure with a wired system? And so you have sort of that cost everybody's trying to deal with, where these other countries have leapfrogged to wireless. I woke up in the middle of the night and, I don't know, some show on about, is it the PESA, where they're doing all the, with cell phones in India and elsewhere, doing all their banking now, texting.
Well, in a lot of schools in Africa, they're using little cell phones to do their schoolwork. They're using them as computers. And they're getting their information
from each other.
From the internet. They're getting their classes.
Not during the tests now.
Yeah. But it's, the thing about wireless is that ultimately there's, lots of technology and lots of ways of acquiring that. I mean, then you break it up into a lot of different issues, which is what kind of unit you have at the end of the system. And you can have a wide range of those, some that are extremely inexpensive and you can give away, and some of them which are more complicated that cost money. And you also have, local internet wireless, and you have satellite wireless. So I mean, it's much easier than actually running a wire someplace, which is a guy on a pole, which is a lot of work.
Yeah, one of the Fossil I mentioned earlier, Wheeler County, going to get its first cell service. The guy who used to run the electric co-op was on the board, told me that one person for every 9 miles of power line. And so when you think about that in terms of the telecommunications strategy, now, Ms. Patterson, you were sort of shaking your head about this leapfrog concept.
I think that far be it from me to disagree with Mr. Lucas, but I do feel that from my past experience in technology that wireless is appropriate. All technologies are appropriate. Wireless is very possible to be in Africa in many different small spaces, but ultimately you have to have a fiber connection. You don't have today the capability of wireless to carry the same bandwidth that the fiber carries, nor does it have the capability to survive a lot of the weather conditions that you have with wireless. So I think you're going to have all technologies, and I would hate for the panel to begin to think that it's just going to be totally wireless, because fiber plays a very important part in this.
Okay.
Gentleman's
My time's
time
expired.
has
Thank you.
expired. Let me just note right now that Mr. Pickering, if no one else arrives, will be our final questioner. Then what I'm going to do is ask each one of you to give us our final 1-minute summation that you want the subcommittee to remember as we go forward, and then we will adjourn the hearing. So the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Pickering.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I appreciate you having this very important hearing. I'd like to put a few things in context. In 1934, our policy was universal and monopoly. In 1996, our policy changed to universal but competitive, under the premise that there's only one thing worse than subsidizing there's only one thing worse than subsidizing competition, and that's subsidizing monopoly. That with competition, you give choice, investment, innovation into all markets. And so what I'm concerned, Mr. Mayor, with reverse auctions, could reverse auctions take us back to subsidizing monopoly and simply locking in a lot of markets, rural markets, one provider so that there's no choice in rural America? What is your belief that if we went to reverse auctions, what would be the outcome in those types of markets? Would we have competition or not?
Well, I would only recommend, and I have recommended, that you do reverse auctions and that you provide subsidies in unserved areas. So we're talking about areas that are by definition presently unserved. I think the reverse auction is a way of identifying the least costly way to serve that area. It doesn't preclude others from coming in on top of the provider of last resort if they can provide a competitive service. And as part of the reverse auction mechanism, periodically over some period of time, you rebid. You rebid and see whether you have a lower bidder. But keep in mind that you're talking about areas in which you're assuming that there is no one has come in to provide service. That's the way I think of using it.
But there's no place in the country where we don't have service, because remember, we're universal. So every market, there's someone who's being subsidized. Now, right now, we're subsidizing competition, both the incumbent wireline, new entrants in wireless and independent wireless. If they come into a market, they can receive those subsidies. And so we have multiple providers receiving subsidies. But, and this is where I think it would be a better policy, instead of going to reverse auction where the incumbents or the large companies, AT&T or others, would simply be able to underbid and low bid to eliminate competition. I think it'd be better, and based on, right now it's on identical support, which is on the least efficient technology, the wireline cost. Should we move to a transition where we allow competition to continue, but it's based on the most efficient technology or the lowest cost technology over time, and that would be primarily wireless? Would that be a better type of reform, going to a declining cost, most efficient technology, but maintaining competition?
The problem I have with the way you stated it, Mr. Pickering, is, and it's somewhat of the same mind when I was thinking about Mr. Lucas. I don't think it's useful or ultimately productive to think that you can identify policymakers in advance what the least cost technology over time will be.